The truth about Paul Walker's final words to his daughter was never meant to be discovered. For years they lived quietly inside a weather-worn journal, a small leather book he carried everywhere, tucked beneath scripts, keys, and half-finished plans for a life he believed he still had time to build. The world remembers Paul as a constellation of speed, fame, and sunlit charm. But the story hidden in that journal reveals a different man, a father reckoning with the fragile distances between love and loss. And it all begins on a quiet evening that now feels suspended in amber, the kind of moment that would later haunt those who loved him most, especially the daughter who still opens that journal every year on her birthday, reading the words that were never supposed to be the last. Long before the crash, long before headlines froze his life in a single violent second, Paul had started filling the journal with pieces of himself he rarely shared. He wrote at night mostly, when the noise of the world dimmed enough for him to hear his own doubts. The pages were layered with confessions about fatherhood, fear, and an almost desperate hope that he could be more present, more grounded, more human than the version Hollywood projected onto him. He wrote about his daughter's laughter echoing in the hallways of houses he barely stayed in, about the ache he felt when leaving her for shoots that dragged on for months, about the guilt of a man who loved deeply but lived restlessly. The journal became a quiet promise to do better, to slow down, to give her a childhood filled not with red carpets, but with real memories. Yet even then, destiny pressed in around him like a tightening frame. The closer he came to finding peace, the more chaotic the world around him seemed to grow. Friends noticed the change first. Paul was moving differently, speaking with a softness that unsettled people who only knew the adrenaline-chasing star. On set, he drifted toward the edges, writing between scenes, scribbling things so quickly, his handwriting fractured into loops and angles. When they asked what he was writing, he simply smiled, the kind of smile that said the truth was too tender to hand over. But behind that smile, he carried a quiet fear that time was slipping, that something in the shadows of his life was shifting, even if he couldn't name it. There is a moment described by those close to him, a moment that seemed insignificant at the time. A late afternoon filled with orange light. Paul sitting on the hood of a car, the journal balanced on his knee. He wasn't writing then. He was staring at the words he had already written, tracing the ink with his thumb as though memorizing it. A friend approached and asked what he was thinking about. He answered with a single sentence that would only make sense later. "I just want her to know who I really am." By the middle of that year, the journal had become both a mirror and a confession. Some nights he wrote entire pages addressed directly to his daughter, lines filled with love so vulnerable it felt almost forbidden. Words about how proud he was of her, how frightened he was of not being enough, how he feared the distance that fame created between the man and the myth. And in that same gentle, haunted space, let me ask you something as you listen to this story. Where are you watching from right now? Sometimes sharing a moment, even in silence, pulls us closer to truths we've carried alone. The most heartbreaking part is that Paul never believed these would be final words. They weren't written as farewells. They were written as beginnings, as seeds of a future he swore he would have time to grow. But life is cruelly unpredictable. On the day everything changed, the journal was in his car, resting in the center console, the ribbon marker tucked between two pages he planned to revisit that night. After the accident, after the chaos and sirens and disbelief settling like dust, someone found it. They held it like something holy, a fragile artifact of a man whose voice had been violently silenced. And when his daughter finally received it, when she ran her fingers over the cover her father had worn soft, she felt as though the world had stopped spinning. She opened it slowly, terrified and desperate all at once. The first page she turned to wasn't dated, but the ink was darker than the rest, as though it had been written with unusual pressure. It began with a simple acknowledgement of his own imperfection, a confession of how many times he had failed, followed by an apology shaped like a tearful embrace. And then came the words that would echo through her entire life. Words she would return to every single birthday, reading them aloud as though calling him back into the room. As she read, the world around her dissolved. Every line felt like a whispered message carried through time. Everything he had been too afraid to say when he was alive suddenly laid bare on the page. She read about his dreams for her, dreams bigger than fame could ever offer. She read about the man he was trying to become, the father he wanted her to remember. She read about love, raw, unfiltered, trembling love, and how she had been the only thing in his life that ever truly made him feel whole. And at the bottom of that page, written with the same dark ink, were words she would never forget. If the world ever takes me from you, my love will be the map that leads you home. This was the moment she broke, the moment the finality of his absence collided with the unbearable tenderness of his presence on the page. That sentence became a ritual, a lifeline, a way of keeping him close while life forced her to move forward. Every birthday, before candles or celebrations, she opens the journal, finds that sentence, and reads it softly. Before we continue, if this story is resonating with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more untold stories like this to light, stories that deserve to be remembered. In the months following the tragedy, silence became her closest companion. The noise of the world, news anchors, fans, strangers dissecting her father's death, felt unbearable, like static pressed against her chest. But within that silence, the journal became her anchor. It was more than paper and ink. It was a bridge between two worlds, between what was lost and what refused to fade. Every time she opened it, she could still hear his voice, calm and warm, rising from the words as if he were right there beside her. At first, she read only fragments, small sentences she could handle without breaking down. Words like, "Forgive me," "I'm proud of you," "Always choose kindness." She traced them with trembling fingers, imagining the movement of his hand, the pauses between his breaths, the way he might have looked up after finishing a sentence, thinking, smiling faintly, then writing again. The journal carried not just his thoughts, but his rhythm, his heartbeat, the parts of him that cameras never captured. As the years passed, she began to understand the deeper layers within those pages. It wasn't just a letter from father to daughter. It was a roadmap of healing, written unknowingly by a man who would never see its purpose fulfilled. Each page mirrored the stages of his own internal journey: regret, awareness, redemption. He had written about wanting to slow down, to stop chasing the rush of engines and crowds, and start chasing moments that mattered. There was a section where he spoke of time, how it never really stops, how people waste it trying to outrun themselves. He wrote, "If I could give you one thing, it would be the gift of stillness. Learn to be where your feet are." Those words became her mantra, a phrase she repeated to herself on sleepless nights when grief pressed heavy against her ribs. Friends often asked why she never shared the contents of the journal publicly. After all, the world worshipped her father. Millions would have devoured those words. But she couldn't. The journal wasn't meant for them. It was her inheritance, a sacred conversation between two souls forever divided by time. Some things, she realized, lose their meaning when exposed to the noise of the world. Her father's words were her secret sanctuary, and she guarded them fiercely. On her 18th birthday, something changed. Instead of simply reading, she began to write back. Using the blank pages left at the back of the journal, she started to respond to him, line by line. She wrote about her life, her fears, her moments of pride and pain. She wrote about how the world still saw him as a legend of speed and light, but how she saw him as something quieter, someone who found beauty in sunsets, who loved the ocean more than the cameras, who believed in simplicity. Her words intertwined with his, like two voices crossing decades, transforming grief into dialogue. It was during that ritual that she discovered a hidden note, a small folded paper tucked deep within the back cover. The edges were worn, the ink slightly smudged, but the handwriting was unmistakable. His. The message was short, almost as if it had been written in a hurry. For when you're old enough to understand, love isn't about holding on. It's about learning to let go without losing what you felt. That single sentence altered everything. She began to see her father not as someone frozen in tragedy, but as someone who had, in his final years, already learned to let go of fear, of ego, of the illusion of control. He had been preparing her for this, even if he didn't know it. The journal wasn't just his goodbye. It was his way of teaching her how to live without him. As she read more deeply, she started noticing subtle patterns. Each page carried hidden codes, dates, initials, fragments of song lyrics they used to sing together, references to places they had visited. It was as though he had built a treasure map of memories, guiding her back to the life they had once shared. She followed those clues, visiting old beaches, revisiting family photos, talking to people who had known him not as a star, but as a man. Through these fragments, she began to reconstruct the father she had lost, not the celebrity, but the soul who had once carried her on his shoulders, whispering that she could be anything. There were days when she would sit by the ocean, the same ocean her father had loved so fiercely, and read his words aloud into the wind. People passing by might have thought she was talking to herself, but she wasn't. She was talking to him, to the echo of a love that refused to die. The sea carried her words away, but in her heart, she felt them return, softly, like a response carried by the tide. And somewhere deep inside her, she began to understand the paradox of grief. It's not just about missing someone, but about learning to live with their presence in absence. Her father was gone, but he was everywhere, in the pages of the journal, in the crash of waves, in the rhythm of her breath. The journal was no longer a reminder of death. It had become a map of life. Still, even as years went by, one question lingered in her mind. Had her father known? Had he somehow sensed that his time was running out? That the words he wrote might one day serve as his final message? That mystery haunted her, drawing her back to the journal again and again, searching for answers that might never come. But perhaps that was the lesson all along. That some things aren't meant to be solved, only felt. And if this story has moved you in any way, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Every story we tell carries a piece of someone's truth, and your support helps us keep those memories alive, whispered through the noise of time. Years later, she found herself standing on the edge of everything that had once been her father's world. The same city lights that had followed him now shimmered before her, distant and cold, reflections in glass that looked nothing like the warmth of his smile. Hollywood had moved on, as it always does, feeding on new faces, new tragedies, new stories to fill the void of silence. But she hadn't moved on. She had learned to carry her grief differently, quietly, gracefully, as a part of who she was. The journal had aged by then. The leather had darkened, the pages yellowed slightly, and the smell of old paper had blended with the faint scent of salt from her tears. But the words, his words, remained alive. They spoke to her in moments of doubt, whispering comfort when the world grew too heavy. On nights when she felt lost, she would open it and read one random passage, allowing fate to guide her to the message she needed. Sometimes it was a reminder of love, sometimes a lesson in humility, sometimes simply a fragment of his humor, his boyish laughter captured in ink. She began to understand that the journal wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a mirror of continuity. Each time she read his reflections, she saw her own thoughts reflected back. She realized how much she had become like him, thoughtful, restless, drawn to the quiet beauty of imperfection. And though she had once resented the world that took him from her, she now saw that his journey had left behind something greater than fame. It had left a map of emotional truth. It was on a quiet winter night that she decided to do something she had never dared before. She took the journal to a small cabin by the ocean, the same cabin he had once described in his writings as his place of peace. It had taken her years to find it, tucked away beyond a winding dirt road, surrounded by whispering trees and salt air. Inside, everything was still. The air carried the faint scent of cedar and thyme. She sat by the window, the journal resting on her knees, and for the first time, she read it aloud from beginning to end. Her voice trembled at first, breaking under the weight of memories. But as she continued, something remarkable happened. The words stopped sounding like they belonged to him alone. They began to sound like a dialogue, like two souls speaking through the thin veil that separates the living from the lost. Every page she read seemed to dissolve the distance between them, as though the act of speaking his words out loud was calling him back to her, just for a moment. In that fragile space between the pages and the wind outside, she felt him. Not as a ghost or illusion, but as a presence. Warm, quiet, steady. It was the same feeling she used to have when he'd walk into a room, not needing to say anything to be understood. She paused, tears running down her face, and whispered, "I miss you, Dad." And though the room remained silent, the world outside seemed to respond. The wind shifted, the ocean roared softly against the rocks, and for a single breath, it felt like the earth itself was listening. In one of the later entries, one she had rarely read before, he wrote something that now felt almost prophetic. "If you ever find this," he wrote, "know that I was already preparing to let go. Not because I wanted to leave, but because I finally understood that love isn't meant to be held. It's meant to be shared, even when the person is gone." Those words struck her deeply, like a key unlocking a truth she had resisted for years. Her entire life since his death had been about holding on, clinging to the pain as proof of love. But now, sitting in that cabin with his journal in her lap, she understood what he had tried to teach her. That letting go doesn't mean forgetting, it means freeing love from grief so it can live again. She closed the journal and held it to her chest, feeling the thud of her own heart echo through the cover. It wasn't the first time she had cried for him, but it was the first time the tears felt different, not heavy with sorrow, but light with gratitude. She realized that grief had shaped her, but love had saved her. The next morning, she walked along the beach barefoot, the journal tucked safely under her arm. The sky was overcast, the kind of grey that made the ocean look endless. She thought about how her father had always found peace in the sea, how he used to tell her that every wave was a reminder that life keeps moving no matter what it loses. She opened the journal one last time before the wind grew too strong, and read aloud the words that had haunted her for so long. "If the world ever takes me from you, my love will be the map that leads you home." And suddenly, she knew what she needed to do. She walked closer to the water, letting the waves crash against her ankles. She whispered a thank you, not to the ocean, but to him, to the man who had taught her how to find meaning in loss. Then carefully, she tore a single page from the back of the journal, one of her own letters to him, and let the wind take it. The page danced, twisted, and finally disappeared into the horizon. It wasn't about letting go of him. It was about giving their story back to the world, setting it free like a message in a bottle. That night, she returned home lighter than she had ever felt. She placed the journal on her nightstand, where it remained like a silent guardian. Over time, she started to share small pieces of it, not the most intimate pages, but fragments of her father's wisdom, during interviews and foundations she created in his honor. She wanted the world to remember not just the actor, but the man who believed in kindness, in stillness, in the beauty of fleeting moments. And every year, on her birthday, she still opens the journal. The ritual never changed. Candles, silence, the sound of the ocean playing softly in the background. She reads the same passage, her father's voice alive in her memory. Sometimes she speaks to him, telling him about her life, her successes, her fears. And even though there is no answer, she feels the same familiar warmth, as if he is listening from somewhere beyond words. People often say that time heals all wounds, but she has learned that time doesn't heal, it teaches. It doesn't erase pain, it reshapes it, turning grief into gratitude, loss into legacy. Her father's words had become her compass, her reminder that love never really ends. It simply changes form. And so the journal remains, not as a symbol of tragedy, but of transformation. What began as a father's quiet reflections became a daughter's guide through the storm of growing up without him. Every letter, every line, every smudge of ink became a step toward peace. She learned to live not in the shadow of his absence, but in the light of his presence that still lingers in every word. Before we move to the final chapter of this story, take a breath and look inward. Think about the people you've lost, the words you wish you could have said or heard one last time. What would you write if you knew tomorrow wasn't promised? And as you reflect, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Each story we tell here isn't just about loss. It's about the echoes of love that never fade, about finding meaning in silence, and about remembering that every goodbye carries a hidden beginning. Years had passed, but every word her father wrote still lived within her like a pulse. The journal remained by her bedside, its pages frayed, its edges softened by years of turning. It had travelled with her through every chapter of her life, through love, heartbreak, success, and silence. And though time had built layers between who she was and the little girl who once clung to his hand, that journal still bridged them both. It wasn't just her father's voice she heard when she read it now. It was her own, the woman she had become because of him. On the morning of her 25th birthday, she woke before dawn. The house was quiet, the world outside still half asleep, the sky tinted in the faintest grey blue that always reminded her of him. There was something sacred about this hour, something she had come to cherish. The silence before the day begins, when the world feels close enough to listen. She lit a candle beside the journal and opened it, her fingers trembling slightly as they always did, not from sadness, but from reverence. The smell of old paper filled the room, warm and familiar. She turned to the same page she always began with. If the world ever takes me from you, my love will be the map that leads you home. But this time, she didn't stop there. She kept reading, turning page after page, letting the story of her father's inner world flow through her. The words no longer felt like an ending. They felt like guidance, a conversation that had never really stopped. Midway through the journal, she came across a page she hadn't noticed before. It was written faintly, almost faded by time. She leaned closer, trying to make out the words. "When you're older," it began, "I hope you'll see that life isn't about how long it lasts, but how deeply you live it. Don't waste your time trying to understand why things happen. Just love, fearlessly, recklessly, honestly. That's the only thing that matters." The simplicity of it broke her. It wasn't grand or poetic. It was raw, unguarded, and so profoundly human. Those were the last words of a man who had already understood what so many never do. That love, in its purest form, outlives everything. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, staining the page, blending with the faint traces of his ink. It felt right, as if their emotions, years apart, had finally met in the same place. The candle flickered beside her, and for a moment, she imagined he was there, sitting across from her, smiling the way he always did when he caught her crying over something small. Outside, the morning had begun to rise. The first rays of sunlight cut through the window and fell across the journal. She watched as the light slowly illuminated his handwriting, the dark ink glowing gold for an instant, like the words themselves were alive. And maybe, in some way, they were, because words, real, honest words, never die. They live in the spaces between breaths, in the pauses of memory, in the hearts of those who keep them alive. That day, she decided to do something she had thought about for years. She had been offered countless opportunities to publish the journal, to share her father's final words with the world. Until then, she had always refused. But now, she understood that some stories aren't meant to be hidden forever. They are meant to be shared, not for profit or fame, but to help others find the same kind of healing she had found. So she spent the next year turning her father's words into something new. She created a foundation in his name, not just to honor the actor, but the man who had believed so deeply in kindness, simplicity, and humanity. The foundation would focus on helping children who had lost parents too soon, offering them mentorship, adventure, and hope. Every project began with one sentence: "If the world ever takes someone you love, may their love be the map that leads you home." It became the motto of everything she did, the compass guiding her every decision. And when the Foundation's first program launched, she spoke publicly for the first time about her father's journal, standing on stage beneath soft golden lights, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She shared a few of his words, not all, just enough to remind people of the kind of man he truly was. The audience sat in silence, listening, not to a story about tragedy, but about legacy, about how one man's quiet reflections had become a movement of hope. Afterward, she returned home, exhausted but at peace. She placed the journal back on her nightstand, kissed its cover, and whispered, "We did it, Dad." And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was talking to someone who was gone. She felt like she was talking to someone who had never truly left. There's a strange kind of beauty in grief when it transforms, when it stops being a wound and becomes a window. Through that window, she could finally see her father not as the man frozen in memory, but as a part of everything around her. In the sound of the ocean waves, in the hum of engines, in the laughter she carried into her own life. His presence was no longer something she sought, it was something she carried. One evening, long after the world had gone quiet again, she opened the journal one last time and wrote her final letter to him. Her handwriting had matured, her words more confident than the trembling lines she had written years before. "Dad, you were right. Love doesn't end. It only changes shape. I thought your death was the end of our story, but it was just a different beginning. Every year, I've read your words to find you, but now I read them to find myself. You gave me the strength to live, even when I thought I couldn't. And if love is a map, then you've led me home. Always." She closed the journal softly and placed it beside the candle, now burned low. Outside, the stars stretched endlessly across the sky. The same stars he once pointed out to her when she was a child, telling her that the brightest ones were souls watching over the living. She smiled through her tears, whispering, "Good night, Dad." In that moment, everything was still. No grief, no pain, just peace. The kind that comes when you finally understand that death doesn't end love, it reveals it. So if you've listened this far, if her story has found a place in your heart, remember this: the people we lose are never truly gone. They live in the words they leave behind, in the moments they shaped, in the love we continue to give because of them. And if these words touched you, if they reminded you of someone you've lost, or someone you still hold close, leave a comment sharing their name, so their memory can live here too, among all of us. Because remembering is a kind of resurrection. And before you go, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story. Each story we tell here keeps someone's light alive, and maybe, just maybe, one of those lights will guide you home, just as Paul Walker's words guided his daughter, through loss, through love, and finally into peace.